Good morning and welcome to our post-landing news conference here today to talk about the completion of the first shuttle mission of the year. Our Brewster Shaw, NASA's Director of Space Shuttle Operations, and Wayne Hale, today's entry flight director. Brewster?
Well, good morning and welcome to the culmination of STS-63 with a landing at Kennedy this morning. 63 was a great way to start the flying season for 1995 with a very successful mission. It's nice when things work out as you had planned pre-flight. It's nice when things are a little bit different than you expected, that the teams are adaptable and can handle those differences. And it was a special plus, I think, to be able to even do more negotiation and more cooperation with our Russian partners on this flight than we anticipated. But as you all know, everything went very well. The flight was extremely successful and we're just delighted with it. Wayne?
Well, I'd like to second that. The entry this morning was a very nominal entry. We had some concerns about the weather in Florida, but frankly it turned out to be a beautiful morning to land there. We proceeded on time with no anomalies and came in for just a picture-perfect landing. Everything looked very good. The folks are still pulling the data in the control center, and we'll give it a white glove treatment probably Monday morning, but the first look says everything was just nominal for the entry.
Okay, with that, we'll take questions here in Houston before going down to the Kennedy Space Center. Start off with Mark Carreau.
This is Mark Carreau of the Houston Chronicle for Brewster Shaw. Just wonder from an operating standpoint, from the window for the launch to the landing, was there anything that jumped out that there didn't seem to be anything, but was there anything that really would cause you to change anything for the docking mission or to rethink something? Is there anything that may have been subtle that jumped out of all this?
Well, Mark, you're very perceptive when you say nothing jumps out at you. Nothing jumps out at me either. I think that this flight was as a dress rehearsal for our docking missions starting later this year, very successful. We learned a lot about working with the Russians. We learned a lot about the kinds of things they are concerned with respect to their hardware and their operations, and that was indeed the purpose of this whole activity, was to learn those things and figure out how we're going to have to deal with each other, how we're going to operate together, how we're going to overcome unexpected things that arise. And fortunately, well, I think fortunately, we had the opportunity in a very non-threatening way on this mission to do exactly that. The cooperation and the coordination between the two flight teams was extremely successful. As you know, we were able to accomplish our pre-flight plan even though we had some problems with thrusters on the orbiter. So going through that whole activity of working out those problems really, I think, added tremendously to the flight. Obviously, we lifted off right at the beginning of our 5-minute window. We were ready to go well in advance. We had put in additional holds in the count, and those all seemed to work out very well. Of course, the thing you plan for is not likely what's going to happen to you. There will be surprises in the future, but we think that we are taking steps towards being able to deal with those when they do come up. Especially with the addition of the holds and the way that we got the crew in a little bit early, and everybody was kind of sitting around just sort of waiting for the clock to tick down for the launch itself. The rest of the flight was, I would have to say, typical of the space shuttle operations over the last few years. The team on the ground and the team in the air know what they're doing, and they operate in a very professional manner and get the job done no matter what comes up. So all in all, I think that we didn't, to my knowledge, discover any unexpecteds from the standpoint of things that we'll have to worry about with respect to follow-on docking missions.
Mark, you have a follow-up? Okay, now down to the Kennedy Space Center, Discovery's landing site for questions.
Jim Banky of Florida Today. First, a question for Brewster. In regards to the future docking flights and the problems in the future if you might lose a thruster, do you have any reason to go back and look at changing your flight rules, adjusting flight rules, or coming up with new flight procedures to avoid relying on those low Z jets, at least relying on the redundancy of the low Z jets so you don't have the same problem?
We don't have the same flight rules for 71 as we did for 63. So we've already dealt with that to a certain degree. More importantly than the flight rules, I think we are going to re-examine, we continually re-examine, but certainly we're going to put some more emphasis on how the care and feeding of our thrusters on the ground so that we can minimize leaks and fail-off thrusters in flight. Everybody is aware, I think, of the problem that we have with the thrusters in a humid environment at the Cape, and when you get moisture in those valves, we get metal nitrates forming in there, and we've had problems in the past with that. We have taken steps to minimize that, and we're going to look to see if there's something more we should be doing. I think the fact that we had a couple of problems on this one flight is not indicative of any generic problem. I think it's a probability issue. The rate of thruster problems has not increased in the recent past. But we do continually look at ways to operate better and to ensure that we have mission success. So we're going to look at the care and feeding of the thruster systems. But with respect to flight rules, we have already taken a little different tack with respect to the docking flights because we really are intending to go dock. And we've dealt with those with our flight team and the Russians, and we have a plan, I think, that will be successful.
And one question for Wayne. Wayne, could you talk about the crosswinds this morning? Were you able to get the DTO, or if not, were you able to get any data at all that will be helpful to the future?
Unfortunately, we were not able to get the crosswind DTO, crosswind landing DTO in. We had some hopes for a while. We were a little bit between the choice of two interesting options. If the winds died down too much, we were a little bit afraid that the fog might set in as it did yesterday morning at Kennedy Space Center. On the other hand, if the winds get too high, you run the risk of violating your crosswind limits. Today, the winds were just right to keep the fog from setting in as we had predicted, as our weathermen had predicted, but not quite high enough to get the crosswind DTO. So we'll have to save that for another day. Of course, we always get data on every landing and learn something new, and no doubt when we go back and examine the data closely from this landing, we'll have helped, I hope, reduce our dispersions and allow ourselves more precise predictions in the future.
News for Wayne also about the weather. Yesterday it sounded awfully pessimistic as far as the possibility of landing over here, and it seemed to get gradually a little bit better, and then even at the last minute there was still a little bit lack of confidence until you had to go ahead. Can you go through that and what it seemed like for you, and at what point you seemed pretty confident that we were going to have a KSC landing?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Everybody likes to talk about the weather, and everybody likes to predict the weather, and we have some very highly trained and dedicated individuals here that do a very professional job for us in the best scientific sense. Yesterday, looking at the computer models and all the soundings, they felt that this front, which is even now heading down toward the Cape, was going to be closer than in fact it got. As that front comes closer, there's going to be a deterioration in the weather. As often happens, these cold fronts slow down sometimes, sometimes speed up, but in this case it slowed down and allowed us a little bit more breathing room to land safely. And I would say that when we came in today, about 5.5 or 6 hours before the landing, and got our first weather briefing, the entry team got their first weather briefing of the morning, it became pretty clear that conditions were improving. We were able to tell the folks out in California that we knew we weren't going to try to come there the first opportunity that they had, even at that early point. And as the morning went on, we just continued to watch it, and it stayed stable and good. And It's just one of those things you don't call the weather before you have to. You get as close to the time that you want to land as you can get, and take a look at all the indications and readings and trends, and make the call at that point. That's the best way to do business.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about the thruster on the rear right ohms pod with the manifold, what you did as far as shutting off, repressurizing it, and what the signature looked like from the prop view? It's pretty obvious over here, the way the escape team went through so quickly, that there wasn't any leak after landing.
I am pleased to report to you that in fact, the folks on the ground reported no delay in their operations. They were able to get a safety assessment and proceed ops normal very quickly, because there was effectively no vapor coming out of that jet. The procedure that we had developed over the last couple of days for entry, we executed that today without really any hitch. We pressurized the manifold, the piece of plumbing that the leaking jet is on, about 3.5 or 4 hours before the deorbit burn. At that time, it was clear that the thruster was still leaking. We were still losing a couple of cc's a minute of propellant out that thruster, and it continued to leak on down through entry. Now, the plan to repressurize that piece of plumbing was an attempt to keep contamination out of that jet. In other words, if you've got a line at vacuum that's got a leak in it, as you come down into the atmosphere, it's going to draw in humidity and air, and that can cause problems. So in an attempt not to have any more turnaround problems, minimize our problems in the future, we wanted to have pressure in that manifold. And we also knew we wanted to minimize the hazard to the ground crew. So if you'll recall, when I talked to you yesterday, I told you we were going to close that manifold about 2 minutes before landing. That's when we did. When Eileen Collins closed it about 2.5 minutes before landing. And there effectively was nothing left under pressure to leak out. There was enough pressure to keep the contamination from coming in, but there was no leakage effectively coming out of the jet, so it didn't impede our ground operations at all.
This is Jim McKenna with Aviation Week. It seemed to be an extremely smooth touchdown. What, if any, initial numbers do you have on the sink rate and the touchdown speed for the orbiter?
I'm sorry, I came away from the control center. The folks were still pulling those numbers, and I just don't have them with me now. But I agree, from looking at the video and watching the data as it occurs in real time, it seemed like everything was very smooth, and I suspect the sink rate was very small.
That long-awaited, I guess, ground fog seemed to rise up on the approach end of the runway. What, if any, measurements did you get on the obstruction to the approach end just before landing?
The report that I got from the weatherman as I was leaving, they always get a report to verify their forecast. At the landing time was no obstruction to visibility, and they were still carrying unlimited visibility. It was the report that I had.
Okay, and my last question, you have finally now gotten to land an orbiter on the newly modified SLF surface. What analysis and work remains to be done before you get a decision on raising the crosswind limits there?
Well, there's still some work to be done. We're hopeful that we get that within the year. Certainly, the tire wear concern that we had has been alleviated now that we've resurfaced that runway. We're going to take a good look at the tires post-landing here and see how they look. I frankly haven't heard any reports yet, but hopefully everything will be ops normal, and we'll be able to increase that limit safely in the near future.
Reg Turnell, Space Technology International. I wonder if either of you can give us any idea of what sort of cross-checking you've now got to do with the Russians before you make final decisions on the June docking, and whether you're on target for any particular date, and if you don't hit the first date, how much do you have to slip it?
The activities that will take place between now and flight for 71 on our side will be our nominal preparation for flight activities with respect to dealing with the hardware and our certification of flight readiness process. We will insert a few additional activities that will include the Russians, and we will have essentially a preliminary flight readiness review with the Russians before we have our normal flight readiness review at Kennedy a couple of weeks prior to launch. And through that process of bringing them into our flight readiness process, we will ensure that not only are we ready to go on our side, but the Russians are ready to receive us on their side, and everything that needs to be done on both sides of the ocean have been completed, and everyone is ready for the flight. The flight is currently carried on the manifest as a 24 May launch date. We believe that we will probably be flying in our first part of June. It depends upon the culmination of some activities on the Russian side as to which date actually gets picked as we get closer to flight. But we have a reasonable window in number of days at which we can go, and we expect to hit those on the first try. The hardware that we need in the orbiter to accomplish that mission is at Kennedy, and is being prepared to be installed in the vehicle and tested and checked out down there, just like we normally do with our flight hardware. And that is all on schedule and on track, and all the planning has been laid in to accomplish that. And the same thing is true on the Russian side. They are walking down a process toward flight readiness on their side as well. So I don't anticipate currently any hits to being able to fly this mission in June.
This is Beth Dickey with Reuters. This morning when you all were reading up a burn pad to the crew, we thought we heard you say that Weatherby would be flying automatic through the hack. Could you explain what that means, and does that mean that Eileen did not get any stick time today?
Well, in point of fact, to the best of our knowledge, Eileen did not get any stick time, and that is standard operation. PLT does not get any stick time as long as everything is ops normal with the commander. The reason, and this was something that we had practiced in the integrated simulations and training session with the crew, is that the particular approach that we had gave a very limited amount of time from the point at which the vehicle goes subsonic until there's a very abrupt turn onto the hack, and this was a rather large heading alignment cone turn today. And through the course of those training sessions, Jim Weatherby and the flight control team had come to the conclusion that the best way to make that initial turn onto the heading alignment circle was in auto. It's not the first time we've done that, but that was our recommendation from the ground team's point of view. It's what he'd practiced, and he affirmed that that's what his intention was and what he desired to do. And in fact, he did allow the auto guidance system to make that turn onto the heading alignment circle and fly the first, maybe quarter of the turn in automatic before he took over manually and flew the rest of the way through touchdown.
Elizabeth Turner, WTEC, TV16, Orlando. My question is for Brewster Shaw on the landing of the shuttle piloted by Eileen Collins. How would you rate her, 1 through 10?
I think Wayne just said that the commander is the one that flies the vehicle for landing. That's our standard procedure, and that's the way that we always do it. So Eileen didn't hand fly the vehicle any today, if that's what you're referring to. But from the responsibilities that Eileen did have as pilot in the right seat, as far as we're aware, she did everything just right.
Thank you.
Seth Borenstein, Orlando Sentinel for Brewster Shaw. In terms of after learning through this mission with the leaky jets, the dealings with the Russians to get them to giving them the information so they could agree to allow the close proximity, do you feel that there's a little more trust established between NASA and the Russians right now after you've gone through this this experience?
Absolutely. Anytime you start talking to your neighbor, you develop a greater sense of trust. And The Russians have been in the space business a long time. We've been in the space business a long time. We have both had great successes and some failures, but we're both mature space operating countries, and we respect the ability of the Russians to conduct their operations and the robustness and capability of the hardware they fly. I'm sure that they respect our program in the same way. So when you get two engineers, one from the United States of America and one from Russia, who have common interests and common goals and work in common fields, sitting down talking to each other, you would expect them to come to agreement on very many things, and I expect that that's what will happen as we proceed with our activities with the Russians. I think that both countries are going to enjoy this activity very much. I think that both countries will benefit from it very much. Just look at the goodwill that was created on this flight when you saw television pictures from each vehicle of the other at the same time. That sort of thing will go a long way towards making the people of the United States comfortable with the people of Russia and vice versa, I believe.
To follow up on that, do you think when this problem first arose, it was a couple days of exchanging information from Houston to Moscow in terms of trying to give them all the information so they would concur with NASA's feeling that you can go ahead with the close rendezvous? Do you think that if this type of thing occurs next time, they might be quicker to agree with you?
Expect the Russians to be just as technically rigorous in the future as they demonstrated this mission. I would expect that we would be if the situation were reversed. Neither of us want to take undue risk with our hardware and our crew members, and we certainly would want to be happy that we understood whatever situation came up, and that we understood the relative risks and gains, and I'm sure that the Russians feel exactly the same way.
This is Jim McKenna with Aviation Week again. Mr. Cabana, I guess, reported that the winds in the early part of the hack made for an aggressive turn into the hack when he was doing the approaches. What role, if any, did that play in the decision to go to auto through the initial part of the hack? And was the turn for the orbiter, in fact, aggressive? And if so, what control inputs did you see that made it so?
Well, the situation that we had with the jet stream about 110 knots at altitude at the point which the shuttle turns on to the heading alignment cylinder certainly emphasized the fact that allowing auto to do it would be the prudent thing to do, but there were no unusual or extraneous or even unpredicted commands. The bank angle was just about what we thought it was going to be, and so forth. So the comment really was from one experienced shuttle commander to another experienced shuttle commander is that this turn, if you fly it manually, is one that you have to be right on top of and follow your guidance needles very closely. And Bob concurred with the team's decision, I believe, to fly it in auto, and that certainly was what we did, and it worked out very well.
Okay, Mr. Cabana also reported a shear at about 500 feet. Did you, in fact, see one for the orbiter coming through that altitude?
Again, I think that's a question that we're going to have to ask the crew when they get back, and when we get into the detailed data review. Clearly the winds 500 feet or so off the surface were 20 to 25 knots, and at the surface they were 8 or so knots, so there was a decrease, which is a normal kind of thing in the morning, where you have a little temperature inversion near the ground level. That's what he was talking about. He also said, if you were listening, that he didn't consider it to be an issue or a problem, and in fact, I don't believe it turned out to cause any significant concern to the commander or in any way affect the flying of the vehicle.
Jim Banky of Florida Today with one more for Brewster. In regards to Eileen Collins, but about pilots more in generic terms, she's had her first flight now. Will she get one more flight as a pilot before she moves into the left seat? Is there any hard and fast rules or guidelines along those lines? Or does she get a turn in the left seat the next time she goes up?
Well, there are no hard and fast rules with respect to that. Crew members are assigned, let's see, how do we say that, for the good of the government? In other words, when a flight comes along and the astronaut office and the flight crew ops directorate are laying out crews, they look at what the requirements for the particular flight are, who's available, and who has the best mix of skills, experience, or whatever is required to satisfy the requirements of that mission, and thus out comes a crew. So there's no way for me to predict when or where Eileen is going to fly again.
Stefano Coledan for Aeronautica e Difesa. Could you confirm that the Russian cosmonauts were able to see the landing of the shuttle live on the Mir station?
The report that we had from the control center in Moscow was that they were getting good television of the landing and the post-landing activities, and they were passing it along to the Mir. And in fact, we got reported back through them congratulations from the Mir crew on a beautiful landing, and we reported that to Jim Weatherby and Eileen Collins and the rest of the crew before they exited the shuttlecraft.
So you mean they saw it live?
Yes. Yes, they saw it. It was transferred live to Moscow and sent up to the Mir station live.
Okay, no other questions, so we'll call this briefing to a close with two programming notes. We'll be returning to the Kennedy Space Center in a moment for more replays of this morning's landing. And then a few hours from now, the astronauts post-landing news conference originating from the Kennedy Space Center. Thank you.